Hello there, guys. We are on to Unit 5. Quite remarkably, we are flying through this series, and we're actually entering the kind of next series of units with the way in which the Cold War course is chunked up. Because we're now beginning to look at the widening of the Cold War between 1949 to 1955. And I suppose the best way to illustrate that to you guys is through the spec. And if we go to our spec maps here, you can see we've moved past the first 4 units. We're moving on to Unit 5, which falls under the widening of the Cold War between 1949 to 55. And of course, in today's video, we're going to be looking at US containment in action in Asia, and we're going to be covering these different things. We're going to be covering the reconstruction of Japan and US-Japanese relations, support for Jiang Jiechi and policy towards China and Taiwan, the defensive perimeter strategy, and then just a little bit on South Korea and NSC-68. But the vast majority of this unit actually covers this here, the reconstruction of Japan, but we will begin to get a bit Korea-y by the end, shall we say, before we, of course, look at the Korean War between 1950 to 1953 in Unit 6. So we'll almost nicely tee us up for Unit 6 there. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And yeah, as I said, the main years we'll be covering really will be kind of 1949, or actually a bit earlier than that. At some point, some bits in the mid 40s, so kind of 45 through to 47. But the majority will be looking from 49 up to kind of like 51, 52 really, and mostly focusing on Japan, Taiwan, and a little bit on Korea. So I want to set up with this timeline slide, and you know I love a timeline, but just as we're entering this next series of units, I think it's really important that we flesh out the context and give ourselves a sense of these 5 to 6 years of in the Cold War. So we're now entering a new phase of the Cold War ultimately. Up to 1949, most tension had been centered in Europe, Berlin, Germany, NATO, etc. But in 1949, 3 things happen that fundamentally shift the Cold War into much more of a focus on the Asian theatre of war, shall we say. And here are some of them. So just reminding us about the Berlin blockade, we've got NATO being formed and the Berlin blockade ending by the May of 1949. And then we've got West and East Germany formed. However, what we're thinking about for this unit, because all these different bits really, these come under Units 4. What we're focusing in on today and across this unit is some of these crucial moments. The USSR testing its first atomic bomb in August 1949, ending the US's nuclear monopoly. Mao winning the Chinese Civil War by the end of 1949. And then, of course, we've got the Sino-Soviet alliance by January 1950. And then we've, of course, got that huge moment in North Korea, in Korea, shall I say, with the North Koreans invading South Korea. We've then got the UN intervention in the war and the Chinese intervention or kind of counterattack. We've then got Eisenhower elected president of the US in 1952, becoming president in 1953. We've got the death of Stalin, we've got the end of the Korean War, we've got SEATO being formed and the Warsaw Pact being formed as well as developments over the H-bomb in the early 1950s too, but this comes into Unit 10. So that's really fleshing out the context here. And as we can see, the theatre of war really kind of moves from Europe into the Asian theatre or the Pacific theatre, as we could call it, and when we think about it from the kind of US-Soviet perspective there. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on, the globalization of containment and the shifting focus away from Europe, where realistically the boundaries post-Berlin blockade, post-NATO, become quite static. Eastern Europe's been Sovietized, Western Europe's fairly secure within the capitalist sphere of influence. So actually now we're beginning to compete for new areas such as Asia and the Pacific. So, I forgot to mention McCarthyism, of course. So we will look at McCarthyism in Unit 7 and Unit 8, which is really, really interesting. I forgot to mention that. So let's have a look at US policy towards Japan in the early years. So this is pre-1947. Now, you don't technically need to know this. It's not on the spec, but I think it's really, really good context for thinking about the change between 47 and afterwards. So immediately after Japan's surrender in August 1945, the US occupies Japan alone. The US began basically the sole occupation of the country, of course, under General Douglas MacArthur, as we will see. Now, as we said, MacArthur is given decision-making powers to rebuild Japan, but the early occupation is actually fairly harsh and quite reformist. These are some of the early policies. Initially, the demilitarization of Japan, unsurprising after the war. War crimes trials, actually similarly in line with what happened in Germany. Breaking up of big industrial conglomerates, so big powerful industries, they were broken up. Now, they were broken up because they feared that if they allowed these big businesses and big industries to continue to proliferate and grow, that actually it could be a way in which Japan slides back in towards, well, essentially fascistic tendencies, and these big industries could be used in the wrong hands to produce weapons, as they had done during the war, many of them. New democratic constitution and re-education. When we say re-education, it really is trying to kind of purge some of the ideas that drove the kind of militant version of Japanese nationalism in the 1920s and 1930s. And that was the aim, really, to prevent Japan ever becoming militaristic again. And at this point, Japan is treated as a defeated enemy, not a future ally. And I think that's crucial. Think of Japan being treated as a defeated enemy, not a future ally. But as we know, that of course changes. And for us, what I want us to be thinking about now is, well, why did this change happen? Why was there this reverse course policy towards Japan? And shout out to ChatGPT for this one. I'm so proud of this. General Douglas MacArthur. It doesn't really look much like him, or maybe a younger MacArthur. And then I asked ChatGPT to put MacArthur in a Japanese car from the 1950s, reversing. That's why he's looking, back out the car, like when you lean back to reverse. And I've got a little Japanese flag. And I asked for the caption, "Let's get capitalism going, boys." So yeah, there we go. The reverse course policy, perfectly dual coded for you guys. But what I want you guys to be thinking about is not just that image, but why by 1947 does US policy change so dramatically? Just have a think about that in your heads. And I'm going to give you the answer now. And there are three main reasons, because there are three main pressures at the time. One, the Soviet Union has, of course, consolidated control in Eastern Europe. So in essence, the Cold War is much more firmly on. So the Americans think, well, if the Soviets are going to Sovietize countries in Eastern Europe, then we essentially want to be able to have strong influence over Japan and build it into a capitalist ally or a capitalist beacon for democratic values in the East. Also, we have to remember that communist movements are gaining strength in Asia when we think about China and the Chinese Civil War, but when we also begin to think about what's happening in Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, it's not completely clear at this point Ho Chi Minh's politics, but there are obviously rumblings there whilst he is fighting a long bloody war against the French between 1945, or well, 46, most people say the First Indochina War, 45-46, up until 1954 and the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And the long telegram, we could say as well, that just again accelerates tension. But most crucially, Mao's success versus Jiang Jiechi in the Chinese Civil War. That's really when it begins to accelerate. And yes, I know that is 1949 officially, but by 47, it's becoming clear that the communists have the upper hand in the Chinese Civil War. So suddenly, Japan's role changes. Instead of weakening Japan, the US now needs Japan to be strong. It needs it to be economically stable, capitalist, and ultimately anti-communist. This is the reverse course. That's why it's called the reverse course. It's like you have a plan and then you reverse out of it. Japan shifts from a punished enemy to becoming a very important geostrategic and geopolitical asset, as we will see. So let's have a look at this now. Let's have a big, I forgot I had this slide. So just to restate that, by keeping Japan and Taiwan, of course, as we'll see eventually, which becomes a key area that the Americans tried to protect across the 1950s from Chinese aggression, By keeping them both capitalist and democratic, they can act as beacons for these values in Asia. And by not falling to communism, it would halt the domino effect of countries falling to communism and help basically weaken the bamboo curtain, or stop the bamboo curtain from growing outside of outside of China and Russia here, or the USSR, I should say. So let's just remind ourselves of the key players. We've of course got General Douglas MacArthur. He was the Supreme Commander of the US forces in the Pacific during World War II, which made him a really likely character to take over and be governor of Japan during the period after World War II, which he does of course become. But just a reminder, Emperor Hirohito, the man behind kind of Japan's fierce nationalistic rise in the 1920s and 30s, he's allowed to stay on. And that is quite remarkable, and I suppose it does go to show how Japan was being treated differently to Germany. I mean, think about it. There's no way that leading Nazis would have been able to stay on post-1945 for very obvious reasons. But it is fascinating to think about Hirohito being kept on, and maybe some of the conservative instincts that were being maintained by the Americans in Japan. So let's get there. Here we go. This is the stuff you really need to know. This is key. If we get anything on that period from kind of 49 to 55 in Asia, you're going to mention Japan. You're going to mention the US policy towards Japan. You're going to mention the reverse course policy. And you need to know this and basically some of these highlights, some of these key bits of fingertip knowledge. So under the reverse course, the priority becomes economic stabilization. And this means essentially we're not going to punish Japan. Instead, we want to focus on reconstruction. Reconstructing the country. How do you do that? You reconstruct the economy and you build stable, sound institutions on the principle of sound money. And that basically means kind of fiscal conservatism. So how does this happen? Well, the emphasis was on not just a balanced budget, but a super balanced budget, which would essentially leave a budget surplus, meaning that it would leave leftover money that could be saved by the Japanese state because they didn't want Japan going into debt. And Joseph Dodge was the key policymaker that introduced this idea or this concept of a super balanced budget. And that meant strict wage control, tight lending, price controls, and the focus on ending inflation. And this does cause short-term pain. Unemployment does rise, but it stabilizes Japan in the medium term. And eventually the American aim is to have this export-led recovery model. So this real focus on exports with Japan's fantastic industries and industrial base that eventually makes Japan into one of the most powerful economies in the world, which it is today. And it's known as one of the key Asian tigers or Asian tiger economies in the 1970s, which was basically used to refer to some of the key South Asian and East Asian, they were predominantly East Asian countries like Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, those countries whose economies were just absolutely booming. Now, after this, in the early 1950s, Japan is integrated into the GATT system. Now, GATT stands for the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And this basically just means low tariffs or international trade. So once Japan is then integrated into that kind of world trading order, again, it can become an even bigger economic player on the world stage. And that does happen. Japan today is one of the most powerful economies in the world. And really by the end of the 1950s, it was becoming one of the fastest growing economies in the world because of obviously the creativity of the Japanese people and a lot of the outstanding production base that they have in industry, but a lot of it is also because of American influence too, and we shouldn't strip the Americans out of this story. So that's what I want you guys to know. Reverse course, reconstruction, super balanced budget, and then being integrated into GATT. Those are the key bits of knowledge that we need to know. So let's look at this case study. I love this case study. I think Mr. Sayer taught it to you because I was texting him earlier that I was making this video and he said, well, he didn't say Mr. Trudgeon, he said, Kurt, you've got to introduce a slide on Mitsubishi. You've got to look at it. It's a great case study. I love it. And I was like, you know what, Mr. Sayer, just for you. He knows that I would do anything for him. So let's look at the Mitsubishi case study. And I've titled this Punishment to Partnership because I actually think that's a really, really good way of phrasing it. So to make this concrete, in 1945, Mitsubishi, which was basically a huge Zaibatsu, Zaibatsu just basically means an industrial conglomerate, like it was a huge, powerful company. Zaibatsu is the official Japanese term for it. It's broken up. So the US policy in that early period was to break up these big businesses to prevent militarism. Now, why to prevent militarism? Because during the war, what had happened is Mitsubishi had ended up producing parts for the war effort. And if you have these huge companies with huge industrial bases, huge factories, talented workforces, they could very easily and quickly be shifted to producing weapons, which the Americans don't want, and they see that as a threat in the early years. So assets are dissolved, decentralized under occupation reforms, and there's a focus on democratization and weakening these big industrial elite families or companies. Okay, so that's the early focus. And again, if we want to title this, we can call it punishment. But then, of course, by 1947, the Cold War's underway. There is a shifting focus within Japan into developing it as an ally. Then we get this, we get the reverse course. And what happens? Well, the fear of communism shifts US priorities, as we know, and economic recovery is now much, much, much more important than punishment. Because the US realizes that breaking up major firms just weakens Japan economically. So the former Zaibatsu re-emerge as Kairatsu. Don't worry about that. It's just a slightly more corporatist version of the way in which these companies operate. So it's slightly more democratic as opposed to just this huge conglomerate control. But don't worry, you don't need to know this. And then Mitsubishi moves from this symbol of militarism to this kind of pillar of capitalist recovery, export-led recovery, exporting lots and lots of their cars and machine parts around the world. And this perfectly illustrates the reverse course to such an extent that Mitsubishi still to this day are one of the most popular car brands in the world, and they were booming in the 1950s and 1960s. Amazing. I love that example. So I got this quote from a historian that I'm going to read out to you. In 1945, Mitsubishi was dismantled as a symbol of Japanese militarism. By 1950, it was rebuilding Japan as a pillar of American containment in Asia. I like that quote, so I thought I'd throw it in there. Great. We have covered that first bit of the spec, which obviously focuses on Japan. But now what I want us to focus on is why US-Japanese relations intensify after 1950. And of course, it is all to do with the connection and the link between these two people and these two states, the USSR and China. Because after Mao's Communist Revolution in China and the Sino-Soviet Pact, the US relations with Japan intensify. They intensify through these three ways: the globalization containment, the San Fran Peace Treaty in 1951, and Japanese rearmament, as we will look at in a few slides' time. But first, I want us to focus on why this happens. And of course, it happens because of China and the early Cold War, because we cannot miss China out from this story. In October 1949, Chairman Mao declares the People's Republic of China. That's the nation state that still exists to this day, still under, in theory, communist control in China. And this, of course, shocks the US. It completely shocks the United States. China is the largest country in Asia, and it is now, of course, communist. Now, this, of course, gets worse when we think about, let me go back a bit, when we think about the relations between these two and the fact that Mao signs the Sino-Soviet Treaty in January 1950, because from Washington's perspective, this looks like a monolithic communist bloc stretching from Eastern Europe all the way to East Asia. And that actually makes sense when we look at a map and we look at this and we see this huge Eastern communist bloc spreading. So the loss of China becomes a major, major domestic political issue in the US. It fuels McCarthyism and anti-communist paranoia that we will look at in a few videos' time. Now, if we're going to go even deeper, which we do need to do, we do need to think a bit about the history of the Chinese Civil War, which really is raging actually from the 1930s. It's an incredibly long and actually bloody war. Now, when Mao wins the Chinese Civil War, Jiang Jiechi and the nationalists retreat to Taiwan. Now, a reminder, Jiang Jiechi is the kind of like center-right nationalist government that the Americans are funding, secretly funding, but funding and supporting. Leader is Jiang Jiechi, also known as Chiang Kai-shek, and be aware of that in case you get a source that could mention either name. So Jiang Jiechi slash Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, they end up retreating to Taiwan. Now, here's where nuance really matters, because initially Truman and Ackerson were not planning heavy intervention in China. In fact, Ackerson's 1949 white paper argued that the US could not have saved China. However, once Mao consolidates his power and signs a Sino-Soviet treaty, Taiwan suddenly becomes strategically crucial. Why? Well, because Taiwan prevents China, the People's Republic of China, okay, this version of China, it basically prevents them from gaining full control of China's coastline. Okay? It also provides the US an aligned foothold in East Asia alongside Japan. Of course, if you think about the Americans having influence here, this is going into the 1950s because, of course, we don't have the Korean War yet. But if we think about the middle of the 1950s, and it stops the perception that all of Asia is falling to communism, again containing communism. And after the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950, Truman orders the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait to basically protect Taiwan from communist invasion. And it's hugely significant. Why is it so significant? Well, because Taiwan becomes a symbol of anti-communist resistance. It's a strategic naval position as well, if we look around here. And it's a political signal that the US will not allow further communist expansion. So Taiwan isn't just about supporting Jiang Jiechi and the KMT, which was the name of his political party. It's all about drawing a line in Asia after the loss of China. And in many ways, Taiwan becomes the Asian equivalent of West Berlin. It's a contested symbol on the edge of the communist world. And it's so, so important that we get that. So that is worth knowing, because you can write paragraphs on Japan, you can write paragraphs on Taiwan, China, Vietnam. If you did get a question on containment in Asia between 1949 to 55, but it would be really, really good if we could write about Taiwan and the Republic of China, not the People's Republic of China, because that's the name of this, Taiwan, the Republic of China, but not the People's Republic of China, which is, of course, the communist version of China, led by Chairman Mao. And this is where I introduced this key concept. And I love this key concept, this brilliant, the bamboo curtain. Can I tell you how I found this? I found this a few years ago in a paper. You know, I'm up for the exam board. I say it all the time. And it must have been my second year marking for the exam board, and this A-star script basically wrote about the bamboo curtain. I'd never heard it before, and then I googled it and I found out that it is actually a concept. It is a thing. It should really feature more in the course. It doesn't, but it's a great bit of knowledge for you guys to know. So what is the bamboo curtain? Well, the bamboo curtain was the political demarcation, or the border, the line between the communist states of East Asia, particularly the People's Republic of China and, of course, the USSR, and the capitalist states of East, Southeast, and South Asia. So if I were to draw the bamboo curtain, I'd be drawing it from here, okay, up, around, dividing North and South Korea perfectly on the 38th parallel, going down to Vietnam here, and then up and around. That is the bamboo curtain. Of course, it's called bamboo because bamboo is basically a type of wood that is associated so strongly with this part of East Asia. And that's why it's called the bamboo curtain, not the iron curtain, of course, that we know the line in Central Europe basically being described as. So yeah, a really kind of good and interesting bit of knowledge for you guys to be aware of, in my opinion. So do make sure that we are on top of that. Brilliant. Fantastic. So yeah, we've already spoken about these different things, and we already know that, which is great. Just a reminder, the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, huge moment. Why? Because that strengthens the bamboo curtain and also creates this, I like this idea, monolithic communist bloc. I highlight that, underline it. That's the impact of the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, which of course worries, angers the Americans and forces them to rethink their foreign policy, essentially, and globalizes containment. There we go. Ossification of the bamboo curtain and leads to the globalization of containment. Fantastic. So we've spoken about the acceleration of US-Japanese relations and kind of the causation, and the causation is, well, Mao's win in the communist civil war, the Chinese Civil War, and then the Sino-Soviet Pact, which then leads to relations intensifying. But what does this actually look like? Well, of course, it looks like this. Let's have a think about these crucial key bits. So the San Fran Peace Treaty that we need to be aware of, which is a really, really important moment within the Cold War. What is the San Fran Peace Treaty? Well, it restores Japanese sovereignty. So the Americans no longer govern Japan. It's passed back over to Japan and the Japanese people. There's no harsh restrictions, particularly within the San Fran Peace Treaty. The Japanese are treated like an ally, not as a defeated war nation. The USSR refused to sign it, but it's still binding, and US-Japanese Security Treaty is signed alongside, which gives the Americans lots of access to Japanese naval bases. And the key point is that Japan becomes a US ally. And you can see the San Fran Peace Treaty being signed here. And then alongside it, what do we have? Well, we have Japanese rearmament. The 75,000 National Police Reserve from 1950, the National Safety Agency is established by 1952, the Self-Defense Forces in 1954, and more US funding and support to basically remilitarize Japan. Why? Well, again, let's go back to this idea of the bamboo curtain. Because if you have a powerful Japan with a military, if it's a strategic capitalist ally, then it can help deter communist advancement into this region here in kind of southern Asia. And Japan can become a useful proxy or a useful ally in Southeast and Eastern Asia. And this, of course, marks militarization of the Cold War. That's one of the key bits of impact here. Brilliant. And the final bits that we need to know here is, of course, NSC 68. And NSC 68 refers to the National Security Council Resolution 68, which is basically a big report that's proposed and then some key decisions are taken off it in 1950. And the content of NSC 68 was a review of the USA strategic objectives and priorities post the A-bomb, so post the atom bomb, of course. The Soviets getting their hands on the atom bomb in August 1949. The impact of this, and the impact is absolutely crucial. It stressed the importance of globalizing the Cold War and expanding containment into Asia. So again, it globalizes containment, and get that into your essays at every possible point. Globalizes containment, NSC 68 globalizes containment. But what does this actually look like in practicality? Because this is basically, globalizing containment is a pretty broad doctrine. It's a pretty broad set of principles or things to say. How do you do that? Well, of course, you come up with some sort of strategy or some sort of clearer policy. And we see this with the defensive perimeter strategy and the Ackerson line. So this is developed by Ackerson and Truman, and the defensive perimeter strategy is basically the military defensive line that the US would maintain in Asia. And Dean Ackerson, Secretary of State at the time, outlines this perimeter and says that it would include the Aleutian Islands, Japan, the Ryukyu Islands, and the Philippines. It basically go from here. It would, of course, go around Japan, crucially not Korea, around the Ryukyu Islands and down past the Philippines to protect the Philippines. Now, I want to just show you, I'm going to be a bit experimental here. Should we see if this works? Believe. Yeah, I got Google Earth up. And you can see, oh my God, I'm already getting nervous. Here we go, we've got the Aleutian Islands here. This is by far the riskiest thing I've ever done on these videos. There you go, so you've got the Aleutian Islands here, which is basically off the coast of Alaska, so that makes sense because it's actually American territory. You draw a line there, woo, round here. Where's Japan? Ooh, round Japan, whoop, not Korea. No, not Korea. Down to the Ryukyu Islands, which are around here. Get them right. Here are the Ryukyu Islands, Okinawa, and others. You don't include Taiwan, but you do include the Philippines. So that's kind of the line that the Americans were drawing, saying, if you cross there, if communism spreads to here, then we will intervene. And just to really hammer home the point, I'm going to draw the line on here. Or I hope I am. Let me look, move quickly. Here we go. Let me draw the line here. Pen, There we go. That is the Defensive Perimeter Strategy, or DPS, and that is the Ackerson line that was drawn in the early 1950s. Brilliant. Now, the crucial thing here is, of course, that it was widely criticised for omitting Korea. Notably, Korea and Taiwan are ambiguous at best or omitted. Some historians argue this encouraged Kim Il-sung, but what matters is the logic. The US was trying to define which areas were vital, and ultimately they weren't seen as priorities at the time. Now, the reason they weren't seen as priorities in that crucial line that was introduced on the 12th of January 1950, it was basically, well, the US can't defend everywhere, so it must define a core security line. Now, the controversy of omitting Korea and Taiwan is, well, Korea was seen as a bit peripheral. After World War II, it was divided temporarily. The US don't see it as strategically important compared to Japan. Now, obviously, it would become afterwards, of course, for obvious reasons. And the US also thought that the UN had major responsibility over Korea, so the UN could ultimately, help resolve and litigate any key issues that emerged. Taiwan was omitted, is actually a bit more complex, but the US had just lost China, and Truman didn't want to appear as if the US was creating a more permanent split, and he wanted to avoid commitment to Jiang Jiechi because the nationalists were a bit corrupt and unpopular, and they didn't want to directly provoke war with Mao. Now, into the 1950s, the mid-50s, that does actually happen. The Americans are much more front-footed in supporting Taiwan, over the First and Second Taiwan Strait Crisis, which is, I think, 55 to 58 that occurs. But you don't really need to know that for the purpose of this course. I'm just a massive nerd. So yeah, that's the defensive perimeter strategy, and of course that leads us really nicely into thinking about Korea, that we'll look at in our 6th video, because by omitting Korea, it arguably emboldens Kim Il-sung to launch that invasion in 1950 that invasion of South Korea in 1950, as we will see in our next video. So we're going to move through that nice and quickly. And I've made a mistake because it is not Unit 4. What a silly person. It is Unit 5. I can't believe I've got that wrong. We've come so far. Well, I'm not re-recording it now. That would be a bit foolish. So let's summarize this. Japan is rebuilt as a capitalist ally. Reverse course policy prioritized economic recovery, leading to the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty and gradual rearmament and militarization of Japan in the 1950s to become a key capitalist beacon of democracy and, well, capitalism. China's communist victory in 1949 and the Sino-Soviet Treaty intensified US fears of a communist unified bloc in Asia and the strengthening of the Bamboo Curtain. And actually, in many ways, it's this that leads to the acceleration of this, the rebuilding of Japan. The US, of course, supported Jiang Jiechi's regime in Taiwan, ensuring it remained a non-communist stronghold and symbol of resistance to Mao by funding the KMT secretly and Jiang Jiechi's nationalist group, his Republic of China, not the People's Republic of China. NSC 68 in 1950 globalizes containment, advocating major military expansion in response to the Soviet atom bomb and the loss of China. And then finally, the defensive perimeter strategy in the Korean War transformed containment in Asia from economic reconstruction to active military commitment. And that was, of course, in 1950, when we get the Korean War and we get the UN intervention and the Americans sending troops by 1950, becoming heavily involved in Korea, which is our next video. So what a lovely place to leave it. Thank you so much for listening, guys. Happy revising. I hope you enjoyed that video on Japan, China, and a bit of Taiwan as well. Amazing. Bye-bye.